Hi guys, I'm trying something new here where I read a few books from the same category and then tell you what I think. This has been one of my best nonfiction years ever, mostly because I've been a lot braver about the type of nonfiction I'm trying, and so I'd love to share how that aspect of my reading progresses, and I think this is a good way to keep you in the loop. Ugh, my sinuses. I'm filming in the morning, and you can really tell. The three books I'm going to highlight today are Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe, Marc Reisner's Cadillac Desert, The American West and Its Disappearing Water, and Secondhand Time, The Last of the Soviets by Svetlana Alexievich. Incidentally, that's the order I read them in, and also up to what I would most recommend, although I can comfortably recommend all three. And before we get into it, I read these a few months ago, so they won't be my freshest of takes. A lot of it is based on lingering impressions. And B, when it comes to topic-based nonfiction, I'm way more out of my element than I am with fiction. So although everything on my channel is pretty conversational, at least I hope it is, I'm definitely approaching these types of videos less as a reviewer and more as a general reader. If you've been following this year's nonfiction releases, you've probably heard of Say Nothing. It was published in February and has gone on to make a lot of best of the year lists, including recently the New York Times top 5 nonfiction titles of 2019. And I can see why it's captured so much attention. Keefe interweaves storylines of individuals involved in the Troubles in Northern Ireland from the 1960s to the 1990s. And for those of you who might not be entirely familiar, the Troubles was a conflict between Northern Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics broadly over the constitutional status of the country, whether it would remain with the UK or unite with the rest of Ireland. And it was a violent conflict involving riots, publicly planted explosives, assassinations, no-go zones, and community segregation, and that segregation largely remains to this day. It's also your go-to counterexample when your mildly racist relative starts going off about how Islam is just such a violent religion. I had heard this portrayed as an especially accessible, engrossing history title, and I think the readability factor has been exaggerated insofar as a lot of nonfiction books are this level of readable. But it's interesting because of the subject matter. I expected it to be either really slow and thorough or thrilling and novelistic. The thing is, maybe paradoxically, all of those descriptors were true of my reading experience to one extent or another, because he does get into the weeds of this topic. The scope of his research is evident. There are a lot of facts about Northern Irish factions and demographics, lots of dates and names and backstories, but he also uses the popular history strategy of channeling a lot of these details through a few key figures, people who recur in the story and who you can latch onto. Unsurprisingly, it's these figures that have lingered with me, three in particular. The book opens with Jean McConville, a recent widow and mother of 10 young children who was disappeared one night by masked intruders, and the narrative periodically returns to her family and their search for what happened to her. Then there's Jerry Adams, a significant member of the IRA who went on to be involved in the Good Friday Agreement that officially suspended the conflict. He then became a politician and started denying his pretty clear IRA involvement. And the third figure is Dolores Price, a passionate IRA member who, along with her sister, bombed several sites in London, was imprisoned, and famously underwent bouts of hunger striking and force feeding. I still think about those sections in particular. And Keefe tries to get under the skin of these people, what drives them, what their ultimate goals for Ireland are, and the origins of their beliefs and what sustains them. My favorite part is kind of its own special section in the last third following the Boston College tapes. Weirdly, this was way more exciting to me than any of the actual dangerous parts, because what happened is that Boston College started an oral history project in the early 2000s where they interviewed people who were involved in the Troubles and told them that in exchange for their honesty, they would be guaranteed anonymity until after their deaths. Well, Boston College couldn't necessarily keep that promise, because what happens when the Northern Irish police gain wind of this and argued that those tapes should be used, as evidence in criminal cases? And the book really made me think about competing ways to treat information. One way is as history, something necessary to pass down, sacred, almost, intended for future generations. And another equally passionate way is as implicating testimony, that people should be held accountable for the crimes they committed and that they have admitted to committing, and that your duty is to the past and to those still affected by their actions in the present. I will say, given the wave of praise for Say Nothing, that a major source of that praise is what I didn't like about the book, which is its occasional forays into novelistic or even cinematic writing. I'm going to be jumping around a little, but here's some of the opening pages. The rarest and most valuable objects in the Burns Library are kept in a special enclosure known as the Treasury Room. The key must be signed out. Only a select handful of people can do so. One summer day in 2013, two detectives strode into the Burns Library. They were not Boston detectives. Passing beneath colorful stained glass windows, they approached the treasure room. Just that camera-esque eye on things, like we're on the detective's heels and we get these choppy sentences to build the tension. No. Maybe I've swerved too far in the other direction after being all about fiction for so many years, but I just feel that nonfiction should be able to succeed with the devices of nonfiction, which are equally gripping in their own way, and not have to make these cheap gestures to novels or movies. But that's my quibble, and if any of the other aspects of this have interested you, I think it's well worth a read. Also, side note is that pairing this with the novel Milkman by Anna Burns was great for me. The next title is Cadillac Desert by Marc Reisner, and in many ways it's the most impressive of these three. It's fundamentally changed how I view this subject matter, which is how the American West has begged, borrowed, and stolen, literally moved heaven and earth to bring water to some of the driest places on the globe, creating metropolises out of areas that, if humans had any goddamn sense, would have remained unpopulated in perpetuity. The Western American landscape could not have been clearer that it would remain eternally inhospitable to all sniveling life forms. And yet, in our unbounded optimism and entitlement, we told nature to shove it. This book was published in 1986, and the afterword to the revised edition is from 1992, the year I was born. So I'm curious what has changed in my lifespan, but a lot of this was historical at the time. So he follows John Wesley Powell and his explorations of the barren western frontier. In a wild chapter, he charts the conniving that led to Los Angeles gaining its first big water source and becoming a major city as a consequence. Essentially, they legally stole water from this idyllic community called the Owens Valley several hundred miles away, and over time laid waste to it. The Owens Valley is now arid, and Los Angeles is a sprawling nightmare. Apologies to those of you who live there, but spot the lie. Reisner tracks the national attitude toward dams and water projects throughout the Great Depression's New Deal programs, and then shows how that can-do attitude and sense that the American West is owed something by the federal government, that those ideas lasted well beyond the 1930s. And his broad argument is that the majority of American water projects have displayed very little economic or even geographic sense, let alone common sense, that apparently non-renewable resource, and yet Congress continued to pass these projects overwhelmingly because of tangled state politics. As part of this thread, there's an interesting critique of America's treatment of farmers, recognizing how hard they work individually, but suggesting we've created farmland in many sections of the country where the government has to support crop production to such an extent that it's a clear net loss for taxpayers. It's subsidized by taxpayers throughout the rest of the country. And Reisner doesn't shy away from pointing out that many of these farmers, at least up to the 90s, felt entitled to these massive subsidies at the same time that they criticized other Americans for perceived freeloading. I also want to mention an awful but well-executed section on how American water development has negatively impacted indigenous communities. It'll make your blood boil to read this part, the blatant and repeated injustices. And this kind of thing has happened since the first settlers arrived, but for many of us it's an abstract knowledge, and to be confronted with these details and with this photograph of George Gillette to the left there, a tribal leader who had to watch the signing of a bill that destroyed the lifestyles of the three tribes he was representing. It's so clear in this photo, the people who are unaffected versus the person for whom these decisions are acutely and terribly real. It's funny because this book is over 500 pages, small type, lots of figures, dense factual reading in many ways. This was a commitment. I'm not gonna downplay that. But also, Reisner is easily the most entertaining prose stylist of these three writers. I didn't know that somebody could be so bitter in such a delightful way. He's just constantly amazed by man's vast capacity for rationalization and stupidity, and how bureaucracy enables that combination. So, while I think a smaller portion of readers would enjoy this, there is so much to be enjoyed for those of you who choose to pick it up. And going along with the idea of fiction pairings, I read this around the same time as Inland by Atea Obred and found them wonderfully resonant together. Lastly, let's talk about Secondhand Time by Svetlana Alexievich, translated from Russian by Bela Shayevich. What a book this is. What a bruising book. I'm going to say up front that I'm aware Svetlana Alexievich's techniques are not beyond criticism, especially for Secondhand Time, which was published in 2013 and then in English in 2016. She's a Belarusian Nobel laureate who's known for approaching historical events through a tapestry of disembodied voices. She interviews people and then takes her questions out so that a lot of the time it reads like extended personal musings on a topic. She's known also for rearranging and fiddling with details, and she's open about this aspect of her process. It's not something that's been uncovered, but there's some question as to the accuracy of calling this nonfiction, while at the same time it would feel strange to call it fiction. So I will be referring to this as nonfiction, but with that backdrop so that you can investigate more if you're interested. Secondhand Time includes interviews with now former Soviet citizens from 1991 to 2012 about how the dissolution of the Soviet Union has affected them as individuals. It's her most explicit effort to map the Soviet character, and I love how she talks about the project early on. I'm searching for a language. People speak many different languages. There's the one they use with children, another one for love. There's the language we use to talk to ourselves for our internal monologues. On the street, at work, while traveling. Everywhere you go, you'll hear something different. And it's not just the words, there's something else too. There's even a difference between the way people speak in the morning and how they speak at night. You can see in these interviews, you sense her teasing out that rough poetry of everyday speech. This is kind of a biography of a national soul, except the nation we're talking about has vanished. It only exists in memory now. And memory does funny things to history. There's so much nostalgia in here for the simplicity of the Soviet Union in some ways, the foundational ideal of a nation of workers, nostalgia for the way books and journals were all the more valued in the time when you had to be secretive about them. A lot of the voices in here hate that after the fall of communism, the ones who got ahead were thieves and gangsters and all those willing to be ruthless in this capitalistic free-for-all. The whole framework of success and failure shifted. People with philosophy degrees became janitors in the Soviet Union, and that was viewed neutrally. You were contributing to society in a way that becoming a janitor isn't viewed now, to create new hierarchies only for them to collapse, a new worldview, a new sense of self in relation to a country, and then to have all of it gone. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around it as someone who didn't experience it. And Alexievich is really good at making generational distinctions throughout these conversations. The shift from capitalism, or from communism to capitalism, it was shuddering and jarring for so many, but it didn't affect people of all ages equally. What I like too is that when you're at risk of going too far down that nostalgic path, she redirects you with reminders that the status quo depended on the suffering of millions. And this book gets into the terror famine, anti-Semitism, the Gulag, the KGB. I mean, I felt physically heavier after reading some of these sections, and a few that were particularly difficult involved how former Soviet states like Azerbaijan and Georgia were affected after the fall of communism, and it shows how neighbors turned on one another and committed ethnic murder. But my favorite aspect is Alexievich's look at how masculinity and femininity functioned in the Soviet character. There's a chapter about a boy who was raised his whole life to see war as the mark of a true man. Death and violence and sacrifice were glorified to such an extent that he killed himself as a teenager. It was like this masculine mania overtook all sense of the life he could build. And then one of the final chapters is bananas. It involves a woman who leaves her husband to marry a man on death row who she's never met. She shows up in this remote prison one day and it's like, it's my destiny to marry you. And the man is like, sure. I mean, okay then. But what works so well is that the heightened and even mythical qualities are grounded in a wider consideration of the messages Soviet women received about men, about taking care of men, indulging them, saving them from themselves, so that you're somehow both a wife and a mother to the same sorry person. The thing is, I was consumed by this book while I was reading it. And when I wasn't reading it, I was thinking about it with dread, but also with appreciation. Appreciation for all these stories and perspectives coexisting and for being embedded in mentalities distinct from my own. I don't have a specific fiction pairing for this, but I have a feeling Lyudmila Ulitskaya's books could work really well in that role, so maybe try The Big Green Tent or Jacob's Ladder. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about this new video format and of these 3 titles if you've read them or are planning on reading them, and I'll see you soon for another video.